Hello, I'm Bryce Brown, founder and curator of the Milton Art Bank. Welcome to the virtual edition of Art Talks. I'm honored today to introduce Francis M. Naumann, distinguished curator, scholar, and author. Francis is widely considered one of the preeminent experts on Dada and Surrealism, and he's here today to discuss the life and works of Naomi Savage in context with the exhibition Naomi Savage, Stretching the Limits of Photography at the Milton Art Bank. Please enjoy.
Hello, welcome to this exhibition. It's the first major retrospective of works by the photographer Naomi Savage. It is accompanied by the first major monograph on her work, and it is hoped that through this exhibition, Naomi Savage's work will be understood and seen in its rightful place within the history of photographers of the 20th century, because during her lifetime, it wasn't seen that way. She was the niece of Man Ray, and Man Ray was such a renowned, world-renowned artist that his reputation seemed to override hers. So that whenever she was introduced to someone, she was not introduced as simply a photographer, but as the niece of Man Ray. She lived to accept that. In fact, she made fun of it by having a card made up that said, niece of Man Ray. But as a result, people were always comparing her work to his. And if she had never been the niece of Man Ray, she would have been seen in a completely separate light, likely as a photographer who was endlessly experimenting. She never approached a darkroom and ever thought of it as anything more than a laboratory. She went there in order to explore and re-explore images that she had taken, but never let them be simply the images themselves, but works that could be continuously manipulated in various forms, whether she used double exposure, soft focus. Sometimes she took images that she would engrave as metal plates and display the plate. Anything that would take this idea of what photography was in the past and stretch its boundaries, stretch its limits, make you think about it differently. Not actually respect the medium as a medium per se, but use the medium in order to create a whole series of diverse images. In fact, her work is so different, one from the next, that it's hard to really identify a work by Naomi Savage on stylistic grounds, unless you're looking at those works that fit uniquely into certain categories, like, say, the still lives, or perhaps the images that are derivations of Man Ray's rayographs, or things like that. But otherwise, she jumped from one idea to the next. She could never settle down and be just one thing, because that would bore her. She often said that the whole practice of photography and the reason she continued it to the end of her life was because it was exciting. She couldn't wait every day to get into that darkroom and see what she would come up with. The entire exhibition really begins with a self-portrait by Naomi that was taken when she was shortly back from Hollywood. It was most likely taken in 1949, 1950. Like many of the works, it's undated. When she framed and matted a work, she would write on the mat her signature and give an inscription and provide the date, but she didn't in this case. But this particular photograph, in fact, forms the frontispiece of this book, because it's Naomi's own view of what her career in the future would be like. The subject, you can say, like for any photograph, is shadow and light, and she emphasizes that by putting a spotlight right directly behind her head, and she looks directly out at the viewer with her large-scale box camera right next to her. That's the camera she lugged around when she made her photographs of composers in 1950-51 in New York City. The reason she made a series of composers is because when she went to Bennington College, she couldn't decide whether she wanted to major in photography or music. She loved classical music, and as a result, when she struck out as a photographer on her own, she decided that she would combine the two interests, music and photography, by taking pictures of composers who were living in New York City or in the New York City area. The photograph you see below here is a photograph that Man Ray took of Naomi. Man Ray took this photograph of Naomi when she was in Hollywood studying with him. He later superimposed this fan over the front of the picture as he was wont to do. He did that in several instances, altering the picture after he took it, because that was yet another opportunity to experiment in the darkroom. If Naomi Savage learned anything from her famous uncle, she learned that photography was a continuous effort at experimenting and finding new techniques, new solutions to new problems. The photograph at the very bottom here is Naomi Savage's portrait of Man Ray. So just as he took a picture of her, she took a picture of him. That, by the way, is a tradition that stretches back to the 17th century in Holland. When two famous artists met one another, they painted one another's portrait. In this case, of course, they're both photographers, so they take each other's picture. Naomi saw Man Ray almost as a kind of apparition. You can see there's a bit of an aura around him. He has his pipe in hand, and he's leaning forward, looking over the edge of his glasses, as if always in thought. That was the way he approached photography, and in the end, that's the lesson she learned from him. That photography was not only a place of endless experimentation, but it involved a continuous generation of ideas that then took concrete form when printed in a photographic medium. She also pushed that quite a bit. The medium itself would change because she realized that in the whole printing process, everything along the line to achieve a print became a separate and independent work of art in its own right. Not just the finished product that she was striving toward, all the intermediary steps were also considered finished works of art. We'll see examples of that as we go through the exhibition. The next photograph that's up here in terms of its chronological order is actually the first photograph in the entire exhibition in terms of date. That is a photograph of Naomi seeing herself, and it's a rather interesting portrait. I don't know anyone who's made a self-portrait quite like this, because she's only in her late teens. She's a student at Bennington College, and she is visiting a graveyard, and she sees her shadow against a gravestone, and she takes that picture. You can still see that she has her camera in hand as she takes this picture. Like many of the other early pictures that are in this exhibition, she would recycle them. She would always feel perfectly at liberty to go back, take this image at any given point in her career, especially if she discovered a new technique, and readdress it to make it take on a completely different form with a new medium. You'll see many examples of her self-portrait, which she kept recycling, interestingly enough, until the end of her life. And I think it's a rather interesting metaphor that she takes her self-portrait against a gravestone. It's almost as if this would be her life, and she has this maybe unconscious awareness that it would be, or at least that's the way I interpret this picture. When she studied with Man Ray and she first went out there, I am sure that Man Ray, no one has documented evidence of exactly what occurred, but when he first took her into the darkroom, he probably taught her how to make a rayograph. Because yes, a darkroom is used for the purpose of developing film, but you can avoid the whole film process and the camera if you just take an object and put it on light-sensitive paper. Turn the lights on for a second and it will leave its impression on the paper. I'm fairly certain that that would be the first lesson that Man Ray gave to Naomi Savage, and when she became a photographer in her own right and was living in Princeton, she would be visited many times by the students of Peter Bunnell. Peter Bunnell was the photography teacher at Princeton who formerly worked at the Museum of Modern Art and included several works by Naomi Savage in exhibitions that he organized. But when he would take his classes to visit Naomi, the first thing she would do is make a rayograph, because they could actually physically see her without turning all the lights off, put something on light-sensitive paper and allow it to leave its impression. That's the reason you'll see quite a few rayographs in the exhibition, like these here. Man Ray famously used a slinky in making rayographs. So did Naomi. There's an example here in the exhibition. But sometimes you can't even figure out what she was using. These look to appear like flowers or parts of flowers, possibly a vase. Anything that you could see through that was transparent or translucent would leave its trace like this on the paper. And she did something Man Ray never thought to do. She used toilet paper to make rayographs, like that one that you see in the summit of these pictures here. Because you see, in a rayograph, it's not like a photogram. A photogram is when you put things on light-sensitive paper and they're flat. So as a result, the image ends up being very flat. A rayograph is actually taking those objects and letting the shadow of the object create the opaque projection on to the surface of the paper. And of course, you could achieve that in very subtle ways using toilet paper. And you can see that's just a jumble of toilet paper that she captured by allowing light to reflect on its surface and burn the darker areas into the light-sensitive paper behind it. There's the slinky that I had referred to earlier and couldn't find because it was behind me. These were all completed using that so-called rayographic process. Remember, I'm calling it here a rayograph as opposed to a photogram because of the indebtedness it clearly has to her famous uncle who invented rayographs, in effect. Here you can sometimes make out what the items are that she used. Some appear almost to create an image of some kind, and if she saw an image in it, she would sometimes invent the title, even though that wasn't what was used in order to make it. This, for example, appears to be a skull. It isn't, but that's might be what she titled it. I don't know if she ever gave this particular example a title. She would even use sometimes sculptures, not necessarily hers, but this one by Harry Bertoia, and photographing it in such a way, you end up creating that same rayographic effect. Naomi's single best known work is a work that you see here called Enmeshed Man. This work was shown in the late 60s in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art organized by Peter Bunnell. That exhibition was in fact a show that used all kinds of printing techniques that were not customarily seen in the context of photography, like, say, lithographs. They're after all, they are just simply printed, just as a photographic image is, so he saw no reason that you couldn't include things like this. Well, Naomi took it to the next level. She included a work that's smaller, that size that you see above, in the exhibition, which is basically a plate. The subject matter of it, however, it can be deciphered. In 1951, Naomi spent about a year living in Paris and its environs, and she lived in Sèvres, which is not far from Versailles. She traveled to Versailles and took thousands of photographs of the gardens, especially the sculpture. And that sculpture in the center is the head of the Discobolus. There's a copy there in the gardens of Versailles, and she projected over it the bark of a tree. You could have left it at that, two superimposed images like that, but she didn't. She wanted it to be printed, so she sent it out to create that photographic print. Instead of putting the paper print in the exhibition, she put the metal plate. And at least insofar as I know, that was the first time ever in history that a metal plate was shown as a finished work of art. You could say, of course, that daguerreotypes were metal plates and things of that fashion, but displayed within the context of modern photography, she was the very first to do it, and she did it with this work called The Enmeshed Man. This is the single largest work that is part of the exhibition and one of the largest works she ever made, but it came as a result from doing pictures of presidents in the Johnson Library at the University of Texas at Austin. And she got the job through her connections of having showed at the Museum of Modern Art, and because several people had seen her Enmeshed Man, and when the Johnson Library was being built, she was engaged to do a series of portraits. They're even bigger than the portrait you see here because they're made with separate metal plates. I believe this is made with 6 or 4 separate metal plates. Those in the Johnson Library are made of 12, so they're considerably larger than this and also considerably heavier. If you continue down this run of the exhibition, you'll see other works that are produced also with that rayographic process. But with Naomi, things are often unpredictable. No one, for example, knows exactly what that image records. There is another example of this print in the Museum of Modern Art, and it's just identified as abstraction. But if you look carefully, you can see that it's lights seen from across the river. I have this fantasy in my mind that it might represent something she sees from Jersey City. It is, after all, right, almost within view of New York if you looked and went to the river's edge. But we don't know exactly what it is, but it's blurred enough to create a totally abstract image. And she did that repeatedly also throughout her life because traditional straightforward photography didn't really interest her. Unless she was doing a portrait or something like that, it didn't lend itself to this kind of experimentation that she was already disposed of before in studying with Man Ray. These photographs you see in the other extent of the wall here, some are nature pictures, things that she just simply took of birch trees in the wood, but she was never satisfied with just leaving it at that. This particular work of art is called Cézanne because it reminded her of a view of the interior of a forest that would have appealed to Cézanne. And throughout her career, nearly for over 40 years at least in her career, she would take pictures that reminded her of something else, and she would place them in the context of photographs about artists. So a blurry picture, for example, could look like, let's say, a Seurat. This like Cézanne, a darkened portrait like a Rembrandt. So she would place these, and that would be yet another series of pictures that she did. This wall features metal plates, like the Enmeshed Man engraving that you saw earlier. You can see that she experimented even yet here with various techniques so that the plate would be cut sometimes very deeply, as it is in that case, or sometimes only the surface is treated. This particular image is one that is repeated throughout Naomi Savage's career. It is a portrait of her sister Elaine. Elaine was just a few years older than Naomi. They grew up together. They were very close. But Elaine had the mathematical mind and went to college to study mathematics. And Naomi had the artistic mind and went to college to study art and music. But they started to separate in college, not only because of the physical removal, they were in different places studying, but also because in 1965, her sister was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And she knew that her sister was slowly disappearing. She wasn't the sister she was before in the past. So Naomi kept going back over and over again at a photograph that she took of her sister in 1963. She used it first for a drug catalog, on the cover of it, a little brochure that she did. But whenever she discovered a new technique, she would immediately go to that one picture and use that in order to experiment. And the reason I think this is one of her most important pictures is because it's one of the rare pictures that I've actually discussed with her in detail. The pictures, that is, the series that she did of her sister Elaine. Because I went to an exhibition in 1993 with Naomi, and we talked about why she took so many repeated pictures of her sister, and that is when she explained to me it was because she was slowly deteriorating with every visit that she had from her. She was changing, and Naomi thought that a photographic image could not only stop the deterioration and preserve it, but also rather strangely coincide with it, because you see this gradual deterioration in the pictures that she projected multiple times in various formats, and even to this plate, where in the end, her sister is nothing more than what she then retitled as simply Mask. These other engravings that you see here, this one especially in the top, is the famous picture of the first moon landing in 1969. In 1979, she was asked by the city of Houston to make an image for a park that they were going to dedicate to the first moon landing 10 years earlier. That occurred in 1969. And she requested photographs from the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian, and they sent her probably as many as 25 pictures. She used all of them in various forms, but the most famous one is this one where the astronaut is looking at a readout on his sleeve where you see the curvature of the moon directly behind him. This metal plate that you see below is actually a detail of that same photograph. And she would do that too, blow up certain details to such an extent that you can't read where their original source is unless you have it, as we do in this particular instance. Another theme that ran throughout her career is something she called Saint Bridget. Now, I don't know where she came up with the term Saint Bridget. It's a medieval saint from Ireland. It may be, in fact, that the person who served as the original model was named Bridget. I also had the opportunity to once ask her about that, and she said the image, or at least the woman who seems to serve as this form, was one of her fellow students at Bennington College. And the photograph that she took of her, she called Madonna. And then when she created it in multiple form like this, it transferred into this series that she did based on Saint Bridget. When Naomi Savage was living in Paris, just after she got married, she spent a year there during her honeymoon. She went to the gardens of Versailles and took many photographs. Many not only of the forest around Versailles, but also of the sculptures that were on view in the gardens. She would take these images and use the negatives throughout her career. No matter what new medium she discovered, like when she started to print on these metal plates, Naomi would reuse images that were taken of various sites in Versailles throughout the remainder of her career. And you'll see many examples of that in her work. Man Ray visited Naomi Savage in the United States on several occasions, especially once she set up her own photographic practice. And she used the opportunity to take pictures of him. I suppose the most well-known series are those that she took in 1963 when Man Ray went to Princeton in order to attend the opening of the exhibition of his work at the Princeton Art Museum, which Naomi and her husband David organized, primarily from works that were in their own private collection at the time. There are many memorable photographs that she took not only of Man Ray at that time, but also of Marcel Duchamp, because Marcel Duchamp attended the opening as well and brought out his wife, Teenie, and Man Ray photographed them in the backyard of their home, where you see their daughter Lori also in the background of some of the scenes. But Naomi had photographed Marcel Duchamp for the first time in 1949. She went into New York City when she was taking the photographs of various composers, and through the introduction of her uncle, it was arranged for her to photograph Duchamp. When she did, that photograph shows Duchamp in a very pensive state, maybe appropriately for the kind of art that he made. By this time, Naomi had abandoned her idea of trying to combine a person's music with the subject of the image. In other words, she would try to somehow capture the spirit of a musician. And she also attempted to the degree that it was possible, to capture the spirit of Duchamp by the same token. And I suppose what she was going for was the more contemplative idea of Duchamp, who was a great thinker and the person who, in effect, invented the whole idea of conceptual art. The photographs that exist from that session, Duchamp was quite pleased with and wrote to Man Ray to say that he liked these pictures, and wrote a separate letter to Naomi saying that she should try to teach her daughter to become a photographer, because with Man Ray before her, and then with Naomi and her daughter, there could be a whole family of photographers for the future. Unfortunately, Naomi Savage's daughter, Lori, preferred to become an architect, so that legacy never continued, and in accordance with Duchamp's prediction. There are these photographs that you see here at the bottom are excerpted from those photographs that were taken in 1963 in the backyard of the Savage home in Princeton, New Jersey. When Naomi Savage returned to New York after studying with Man Ray, she embarked upon a whole series of portraits. Portraits, in this case, of composers, because she had the idea that she could combine her interest in music and in photography by simply taking pictures of composers. And the idea was that when she approached a composer, she would somehow try to capture the spirit of what they were uniquely known for. She told me at one point that she abandoned that idea because you really couldn't see the music within the person's face or whatever the surroundings were. But to an extent, it seems to work here. She takes this picture of John Cage, of course, famous for almost non-music, and shows him against a window with light cast severely from one side, almost in semi-darkness. She takes this picture of Edgar Varese and pushes him right up to the plane of the picture, where you can only see the kind of impression of works of art on the back wall, because Edgar Varese, of course, was a famous musician who was the first to combine street sounds within his imagery, so she's bringing part of the background up to the forefront of the image. In the early 1970s, Naomi Savage was asked by the Print Collector's newsletter to write an article about her famous uncle, Man Ray. Instead, rather than write, she submitted a series of portraits that she took of her uncle, but not just simple portraits. They were portraits that all punned on his first name, Man. So it would be Man in Nature, in this case, Multiple Man, where she took separate images of him, cut them out, and repeated them, or things like Man and Woman, which was the case when she had a photograph of Man Ray with his wife Juliet. There are photographs of Juliet included in this exhibition as well. But this series of Man Ray portraits was an ingenious way to respond to a question asked by a magazine. And she used that method of letting her photographs speak for her on many other occasions as well. Whenever she was asked a complicated series of questions by a magazine, by an interview, she would always allow the photographs to make the response. I suppose with a simple idea that pictures speak 1,000 words, they were more accurate than whatever oral response she might come up with. Like all photographers, Naomi Savage was never without her camera. If someone visited her, anyone of any note, she would always ask to take their photograph. That's why we have photographs of people like Lartigue, who happened to be in Princeton at one moment, and she took his photograph. But a person who was a recurrent visitor to Princeton, who she got to know fairly well, was the famous author Philip Roth, who lived in Trenton, New Jersey, and they became close friends, had dinner often. And the photograph she took of Philip Roth in 1963 remained the favorite photograph, his favorite photograph, and he put it on the cover of several of his books. He used Naomi's photographs for covers of other books as well. And Naomi could very well have been just simply a photographer who took pictures of other people, a portrait photographer, because she was instinctively good at it, just as was her famous uncle. In one very memorable photograph she took of the composer Lucas Voss, he was a German emigre who came to the United States after the war, and she met him in Tanglewood. Naomi would often go up to Tanglewood in the summer. That was the great music festival in the out of doors, and many famous musicians would go there. That's where she photographed Aaron Copland, for example. Here she photographed Lucas Voss. But she more likely than not had an involved and complicated relationship with Lucas Voss, because when she chose to include him in the series of composer portraits, she photographed him only from the back. And there is a photograph of him only looking into the darkness. We don't know how the relationship ended, nor any of the details of the relationship. We just know that this was the way in which she chose to depict him in her series of portraits. Only one other artist known to me actually made a portrait of a person showing their back facing the wall, and that was Man Ray, in a photograph that he took of a poet in Paris. And we don't know even the circumstances of why he did that, but it's more likely than not that Naomi knew of the existence of that other photograph. Man Ray always lurked in the background of whatever she did, and there are elements of Man Ray that are reflections to a degree in much of her own work. These photographs show Naomi Savage at the library of Lyndon Johnson, which is in Austin, Texas. at the University of Texas at Austin, and Naomi went out there to oversee the installation of the murals, which show Johnson first as a senator, then as vice president under Kennedy, and then of course as the president himself. And these are the main elements, the main visual elements at the base of the library, the kind of cohesive element that holds the entire library together, and probably the single largest commission that Naomi Savage would have in her entire lifetime. And they remain on view to this day in the Johnson Library.
It is my hope that this exhibition and accompanying publication will reveal Naomi Savage as the endlessly inventive and experimental photographer that she was. Please visit miltonartbank.com for more information on this exhibition, as well as future exhibitions. Thank you for watching.